So the TV show Billions had a therapy scene in it where they used EMDR, a type of therapy that's used for treating traumatic memories and post-traumatic stress disorder. My name's Dante, a psychologist from Australia. Let's give it a review.
Now, this works a little differently than normal therapy.
I work a little differently than normal.
Okay, so we see Chuck, he's sitting across from his therapist who just said, this works a little differently than normal therapy. So EMDR has a bit of a reputation, in part due to its own marketing. And it has a reputation of being different and new and innovative, and in some ways that's true. But mostly, the reality is that EMDR is a type of therapy that's just taken the good bits and pieces of a lot of different other types of therapy and brought them into one. For example, it has aspects of it where it focuses on your thoughts and cognitions, and that's clearly from cognitive therapy. There's other parts of it that look at your body sensations and what those feel like, and those are from somatic type of therapies. And while there's nothing necessarily unique about a type of therapy that combines different elements from other schools of therapy, what is kind of unique in EMDR is two things. One is that there's significantly less talking during an EMDR session compared to something like cognitive therapy. The second is EMDR's use of what they call bilateral stimulation, but in practice what this looks like is techniques that involve getting a person to move their eyes or physical sensations, so for example alternating tapping right to left, left to right. Really anything that just is said to supposedly stimulate the brain from left to right and back and forth. As for whether or not bilateral stimulation is actually a real thing or if it even helps in therapy, I'm going to touch on that a bit later.
I'm not going to challenge or even explore that statement. You know why?
Because this works a little differently than normal therapy.
Traditionally in EMDR therapy, we as the therapist don't do a lot of direct challenging of thoughts.
The mission here is to dim the emotional response to past trauma.
This statement is partly correct, but it's also missing a lot of information. One of the really main hopes with EMDR isn't just dimming the emotional response. It's changing the way that we react to the trauma in its entirety, and it's changing the lessons that we've learned from the trauma. Because say, for example, if the emotional response we have to a traumatic memory gets dimmed, but the way that we think about the trauma, the way that we relate ourselves to the trauma, if that doesn't change at all, then it's very likely that the traumatic memory and the traumatic event and our traumatic experience is still going to be creating a lot of problems for us in the present day. So often in EMDR, there is a goal to lessen the negative emotional response to traumatic memories, but also to address the cognitions, the physical sensations, and to address other memories that are linked to the trauma.
Let's choose some people to use as resources. So you're going to need a comforter, a protector, and a wise person. They can be alive or dead, real or fictional.
So a resource when you're doing trauma therapy is anything that can help you during the reprocessing of a trauma or anything that can help you during a time of significant emotional upheaval. In this particular scene, I don't like what this therapist is doing. He's just telling Chuck, think of 3 people that fill these 3 different roles. But I think that thinking of 3 different people who fill 3 different roles right before jumping into some EMDR reprocessing is basically useless. Because the whole reason you want to prepare to use a resource is because you're expecting significant emotional upheaval. And when you get significantly emotional, big thinking brain not thinking so good. So if you just have all of these ideas about, which resource do I use, which person do I use, it's all just going to be a jumbled mess and you're not going to remember to use any of them properly. So no, I don't like the therapist just telling Chuck to think of a comforter and a protector and another person, because if there comes a time where Chuck needs this because his emotions are too overwhelming, he's not going to remember to actually use them because they haven't been practiced and rehearsed beforehand. And this goes for any skill that you could call a resource, right? Whether that's just paced breathing, whether that's a visualized safe space, whether that's a resourced person that you want to emulate. Practice these things before you need them so that when you need them, you can actually use them properly.
For wisdom, I am a voracious reader of crime fiction, and recently Darkly Dreaming Dexter has found its way to my night table.
So for a wise person, a serial killer, we may need to schedule more sessions.
Not him, his father, of sorts. Harry. He had all the answers.
Okay. A father figure? Good.
So skipping ahead here, Chuck names a couple of real people and a fictional character to use as a resource. And using an imagined character as a resource is completely fine. The only important thing in using a person as a resource is that you can imagine how they would respond to a specific situation, because then you want to try to feel how they would feel in response to it. And in that way, you're essentially learning to cope with the situation as you imagine they would cope with the situation. For example, if this person would feel strong and confident and decisive in the face of adversity, you want to try to imagine how they would feel and then bring those feelings into yourself so that you could feel strong and confident and decisive.
And finally, a safe space. A place where you...
Yale Law Library.
So a safe space is just a visualization technique where you imagine a place in your head where you feel calm and where you feel safe. It's a pretty good technique for times of extreme distress. I don't tend to give it out to everyone or tell everyone to use it at all times, because it runs the risk of every time you feel anxious or stressed, you suddenly start like actively dissociating and sending yourself to a safe space. And it doesn't teach you how to tolerate or properly process emotions and upheaval. It just kind of teaches you how to distract and avoid yourself from them. But distraction and avoidance, or a visualized safe space in this case, they're completely fine when they're used appropriately. And the appropriate time is when your emotions or the traumatic memories are so overwhelming that you need to just take a break from them for a moment. So that's fine, yeah.
Describe a recent moment where you felt betrayed. Drop a plumb line down through your memory. Where does it catch? What image or idea do you associate this betrayal with?
So to access the traumatic memories which are linked to present day problems, sometimes you can start with a present day emotion and then scan back through your mind, through your memories, to see where was the first time you felt that really strongly, or when was the strongest time in your memory that you felt that feeling. So if Chuck came into this therapy because he's complaining about having this constant sense of betrayal that's weighing on his mind, then he could scan back through his memories to find the strongest memory that resonates with this feeling of betrayal, as this memory is probably linked to some of his present day struggles. So how this therapist is doing it, completely fine, yeah. And oftentimes when you're having present day feelings that are kind of out of proportion to what is happening here in the moment, it's probably because something that's happening here in the moment is triggering something from the past. So you're now reacting to something here and now, and you're also reacting to a previous memory, and they're kind of adding together.
9/11.
Traumatic day, for sure.
Yes, but not the day. The monument. Axelrod was being arrested, and she was there.
She. Your wife.
Wendy, yes. I knew she would be there. But, the way they clung to each other.
Yeah, so he's visualizing the memory right now, which will often happen when you recall a memory. When you recall a memory, good or bad, if it was strongly emotional, you'll also recall component pieces of the memory. So for example, your sense data, what you saw, what you heard, what you smelled, what you felt, what you were thinking, what emotions you had, those all also come along for the ride. And whichever pieces of sensory data got stored in that memory, now in the present day, if you see something that reminds you of something, one of those component pieces, that's what we call something is triggering this memory. So for example, if in the memory you saw something very bright and very red, and this was a very emotional memory, then maybe in the present day when you see something very bright and very red, it'll activate this memory because your brain goes, ooh, I've seen that before, let's pull this one up from the memory bank.
What's the emotion associated with that image?
Rage. And, sadness. Jealousy.
Where do you feel that? In your body?
Everywhere.
What negative self-belief does that bring up?
So he's getting the other components of the memory like I touched on. So he got the visual element already. He knows what the image is, what Chuck was seeing. Now he's getting what was he feeling in his emotions, what's he feeling in his body, he's just feeling it everywhere. And he just asked, what's the negative self-belief that comes along with this? Because every traumatic memory, every single one, comes with negative self-beliefs. We encode something negative about ourselves, some type of judgment about ourselves from a trauma.
What negative self-belief does that bring up?
That Axe is a criminal.
And once again, that's a negative belief about the man you call Axe, not you.
Well, once I vanquish him, then I'll be able to focus on Rhodes.
If you do the you part, you may find the him part doesn't matter so much.
I know that should be right, but it just doesn't feel right.
So Chuck just dodged the question about like what is the negative self-belief that comes up from you, and now it seems like the therapist is just moving on and handing him some hand buzzers to immediately keep going with the EMDR. This feels like a big mistake to me. It is really, really important in this process to actually get the person to understand what is the negative self-belief that they have about themselves in relation to a traumatic memory, because it's these negative self-beliefs that are a big part of what makes traumatic memories so destructive to our present day life. Our brain, on some level, can sometimes know that the trauma was in the past. Something that is not just in the past is the beliefs that we have about ourselves. So, for example, if someone goes through a trauma and they're attacked, or they're abandoned, or they're broken up with, or whatever, and the beliefs they come up with are like, I'm not good enough, it's my fault, I'm incompetent, right? And so even though the traumatic event was in the past and it's no longer with them, those beliefs are with you 24 hours a day because they're in your head. So now the trauma is affecting you through these negative beliefs that you learn from it 24 hours a day. And so this therapist just like glazing over the fact that Chuck just dodged this question and not sitting on that for a moment, I think that's a mistake. Because also, once you get a person to think of what are the negative beliefs that they've learned from this trauma, you can then probe and be like, okay, well, if your negative belief is that I'm not good enough to be loved, what's a positive belief that you could have, or a more balanced belief that you could have in relation to this event, right? And maybe it'd be like, I am good enough, or I can learn to be good enough, right? Because that way, once you actually start processing the trauma, the brain is a little bit more prepared, a little bit more primed to start thinking in a more balanced or positive way. So in my opinion, I think the therapist just moving on here without sitting on this for a minute and actually getting some more clear answers from Chuck, I think it's just a mistake.
Yeah, take the tampers. Follow this light with your eyes. You experience traumatic feelings. Focus on the resources in your safe space. Conjure them, trust them. You can practice this all week. Follow the light with your eyes and be with them, especially if you think about the monument site or either of the people you saw there.
So he's given Chuck, he's handed him a couple of handheld buzzers, and what these would do is vibrate right, left, right, left, right, left. And he's activated the light bar, which essentially would just shine a light that goes from side to side, and the idea is that Chuck would follow the light with his eyes. This is what they call bilateral stimulation techniques in EMDR, but again, I'm going to cover a bit more on bilateral stimulation later in this video. And the therapist also told Chuck to practice this all week in relation to the eye movements, like use the eye movements yourself when you feel emotion upheaval or when you have flashbacks to this memory. Teaching the clients eye movements as a calming and coping skill can be done. Definitely, it can be done, but it's generally not advised, and especially not during the first session of therapy. One of the reasons for this is occasionally if you teach this to clients, they'll then go home and be like, well, now I know how to do it, and then they start opening up a bunch of boxes that they've had trauma locked up in for years, and then it just floods and goes everywhere, and it's a really messy process. Another thing that can happen is people start to get emotional, then they'll start to do eye movements to try to calm down, but then because they're doing eye movements, which are associated with linking up and finding new memories and new traumas start popping into their head, and then that gets really messy as well. So this isn't to say that you can never teach the use of eye movements as a calming skill or a grounding skill or a self-help skill, but not like this, not just thrown out randomly. It needs to be with a bit more practice, with a few more guidelines, and maybe a little bit later on in therapy. The therapist also tells Chuck to summon his resources and rely on them, as if Chuck knows what this means. Again, without having practiced how to use these resources first in a helpful way, they're essentially meaningless. Just telling someone to summon their protector in their mind isn't going to help because A, they're not going to remember to do it when they're highly emotional if they haven't practiced it. B, even if they remember something about a protector, they're not going to know what to do with that information because they haven't been told it. Alright, so overall, what would I say? Here's the good parts. Here's some of the information that's real. They display hand buzzers and the light bar, and those are occasionally used in EMDR, not always, but occasionally. They demonstrate that eye movements are a part of EMDR, that's true. Eye movements are definitely a part of EMDR. They show the fact that a therapist will have you access a memory and look at the components of a memory. That's 100% true. That's the most accurate thing that they showed. Some EMDR therapists will teach their clients about using people as a resource or a safe place. That is true. And the last thing I think that they got right is that yes, EMDR therapy, when successful, will dim your emotional response to traumatic events. That's true. Here's some of the bad information or just things that were missing that shouldn't have been missing. The eye movement techniques and other types of resources and safe places will be used in a much more controlled way, and people will be told how to do things with more guidelines so they actually understand it and practiced with it before they go off on their own so they actually know what they're doing. Also, you typically won't just dive straight into what is potentially a traumatic memory in the first 2 minutes of therapy. You want to get a little bit of prep time, get the person to have some calming skills, some coping skills. You want to understand their history so you know that if you open this one memory, you're not just going to suddenly unlock decades of repressed trauma that neither of you are ready for. The use of resources like a protector figure or a safe place visualization, those are used fairly commonly, but again, they are practiced and taught pretty well before they are used, because otherwise they're basically useless. When you are accessing a memory, the therapist and you should get a very clear understanding of what are your negative beliefs about yourself in relation to the memory, and what positive beliefs could you have instead, right? Because you want to understand how is this impacting you now, but you also want to prime your mind to begin thinking in a bit of an alternate way, a bit of a more neutral or balanced way. And also, while working on traumas with EMDR is typically done because they're causing some type of present day problem. So there's a present day problem, and then you work on the past traumatic events that are being triggered, right? So you're working on the past and the present. There's a whole nother prong of EMDR therapy that's focused on the future, which looks at future problem solving and how you're going to react to problems in the future, and that wasn't mentioned at all here. Overall, in terms of how realistic was this scene compared to a real EMDR session, I would probably rate it as a 2 out of 10. They showed some things that do exist in reality, and if an untrained, unethical person masquerading as a therapist glanced at an EMDR brochure and then tried selling EMDR therapy to people, and I glanced in on what that session looked like, it could realistically have looked like that. So it's not a 0 out of 10 in terms of realism. This could possibly exist in the real world, but if you ever go into an EMDR session or a therapy session and it looks like this, watch out. Now, I promised I would talk about bilateral stimulation, so here we go. So EMDR was developed alongside techniques like horizontal eye movements because they found that doing this whilst doing exposure to a traumatic memory seemed to help, right? So EMDR researchers then tried figuring out, like, well, what's going on? Why do these eye movements work? And they came up with a hypothesis that it was because of what they called bilateral stimulation. So the idea was by moving your eyes from one side to the other and back and forth, it would activate one side of the brain and then the other, back and forth, and it got your brain talking to itself across both hemispheres. So then they looked at other techniques, like what if I tap from side to side? What if I play audio tones from side to side? And yes, all of these seem to work. And so they went, wow, bilateral stimulation is one of the reasons that EMDR is so effective. Now, from all of the modern research on bilateral stimulation and the deconstruction research on EMDR, it seems like bilateral stimulation just isn't a real thing. And it seems that a technique just by nature of being bilaterally stimulating isn't necessarily helpful. But, eye movements themselves do seem to be helpful. Side-to-side tapping does seem to be helpful. Alternating audio tones do seem to be helpful. So if all those things are helping in the processing of trauma, but it's not because they're bilaterally stimulating, then what is it? So there's what I would say 2 big reasons, and then 2 kind of hypothetical reasons that there's a little bit of emerging research about. So the first reason these techniques might work is because of grounding. So when we get emotional, lost in our emotions, or lost in our memory, or lost in our thoughts, so long as we're in a safe environment, then becoming attuned to our environment, grounding into our physical body, orienting to where we are, the place and the time that we're in, this is called grounding. And these will help us to calm down and recognize that we're safe and we're in the here and now. And so, for example, eye movements where you're scanning side to side is very orienting. You're constantly scanning the room and you're going, hey, I'm in the present. I know where I am. I'm in my room. I'm safe. I'm with my therapist. I see him in front of me. This is a safe person. That's very grounding. It's very calming. The second reason that these techniques seem to work is because they tax working memory. By having to remember the instructions to use your eyes to follow the therapist's hand or the light bar, or to feel the buzzing tones or the alternating beats, it uses up a bit of your working memory, so that when you're experiencing a traumatic memory, it can't completely flood your working memory and overtake your consciousness, right? So by taxing that bit of working memory, it's reserving a bit of working memory that keeps you in the present. There's probably more that this is doing in terms of working memory, but the research just hasn't shown anything clearly yet, so that's about as far as we know right now. Third possible reason that eye movements specifically might be helpful is because eye movements are associated with recalling a memory. Take, for example, someone or you're in an exam and you're trying to think of an answer, right? And you're looking up, you're looking around, you're like really thinking, right? Or if you're trying to recall a memory, like your favorite holiday, right? People will look around. Eye movements seem to, in some way, be associated with memory recall. So when you're in a trauma processing therapy, you want to, yes, recall the trauma, but you want to recall other associated memories, whether it's other traumas that are related so that you can spread the good effects of therapy, or whether it's other positive memories that kind of counteract some of the negative lessons you learned from the trauma. A fourth possible reason, and I must say the research here is very new and very niche, is that horizontal eye movements, side to side, back and forth, seem to reduce the activation in the amygdala, which is a brain center that's very connected to fear response, threat detection, and so on. So by reducing the amygdala activation, it seems to reduce the fear response. Overall, EMDR works very, very well for working with traumatic memories and post-traumatic stress disorder. The research on that is clear, there's just no doubt about that. Bilateral stimulation as the proposed reason for why this works just doesn't seem to be accurate. But the eye movements and other techniques that they use in EMDR are effective. It's just that there's other explanatory mechanisms for why they work. Billions, the TV show, demonstrated some parts of EMDR that do exist in reality, but it didn't demonstrate anything with remotely enough accuracy or detail to be a good example of what EMDR looks like. If you have any questions about anything in this video, EMDR, therapy in general, leave it as a comment and let me know and I'll get back to you in the next video. Other than that, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video or you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.